3 issues. That's all the newspaper had managed to publish in a year. They had appeared at irregular intervals, on whatever schedule the practical realities of printing allowed. And each one had been produced by a small group of people who, for most of their adult lives, had understood their existence to be a criminal matter. In this country, from 1933 until whenever the law finally changes, and it had not changed yet, as of the autumn I am recording this, a man who has sex with another man commits an act the criminal code addresses with up to 5 years in prison. This is not a theoretical law. It has been applied consistently across decades, with the particular thoroughness that Soviet institutions bring to the enforcement of prohibitions they consider fundamental. Hundreds of thousands of convictions over 50 years, men who served their sentences and came out into a world that had not changed its position, men whose families were informed, whose employers were notified, whose names went into files. The apparatus of persecution had been patient and consistent and very well organized. Into this context, a newspaper had been registered at the Moscow Soviet by filling out the forms. This is the context inside which I read all 3 issues in one sitting, and this is why it took me longer than 3 issues should take to read, because I kept having to put them down and look at the ceiling for a moment. I had read about the registration in a brief item that came across my desk. The Moscow Soviet, the Mossoviet, had registered a printed organ of the Moscow Union of Lesbians and Homosexuals. The newspaper's name was Tema. The word means simply the theme. I sat with that name for a while before I read further. The theme. After 57 years of the criminal code, after all the institutional weight of the state pressing down on the fact of this thing's existence, someone had named the newspaper after the thing that could not be named. The theme. It is either the most defiant act of naming I have encountered in my years of covering this country, or the most exhausted one, and perhaps it is both, which is the category into which many of the most honest acts of this period fall. I tracked down the editor. His name was Roman Kalanin. He was not difficult to find. The 3rd issue of the newspaper contained a contact address, post restante, a Moscow postal code, a woman's name. The postal alias is worth noting because it tells you something about the conditions under which the newspaper existed even after its legal registration. You don't use a woman's name and a general delivery address because you are operating freely. You use a woman's name and a general delivery address because you have learned, over years, that your real name attached to your real address produces consequences, and that some habits of concealment outlast the conditions that made them necessary, because the conditions haven't entirely stopped being necessary. When I reached Kalanin by telephone, he sounded like a man who had been answering questions for a long time and had developed a style for it. Direct, unhurried, neither defensive nor performatively relaxed. He told me about the newspaper. It had been born a year earlier, he said. 3 issues had appeared. Each issue, he said, added courage, not in the sense that the fear was disappearing, but in the sense that the act of printing something and having it circulate and not being immediately destroyed was itself evidence of something that might be named possibility. He said, after years of repressions and underground existence, you don't stop being afraid all at once. The fear has a long half-life. But you can make things anyway. I asked him what the newspaper contained. He said, the things that need to be said to people who have been told for their entire lives that they do not exist, or that they exist in a condition of pathology, or that they exist as criminals. He said, the newspaper says that they exist. This sounds simple, he said. It is not simple. Of the 3 issues I had read in one sitting, one item had stayed with me more than the others. It was not the editorial, it was not a programmatic declaration. It was a short letter from a reader, a man who identified himself only by initials, who wrote that he was 45 years old, that he had been married for 25 years, that he had 2 grown children. He wrote that he had loved 2 people in his life, seriously, both times at the same time as his marriage, both loves unavailable in the one direction that mattered. He had never told anyone, and had not written the letter to be told anything in return. He was writing to thank the newspaper for existing. He had held the 1st issue in his hands, he wrote, and had read it slowly, and had understood that for the first time in his life, a printed text had described what he had lived without naming it an illness or a crime, or a condition requiring correction. He wrote, I am 45, I am not planning to change anything about my life. What I have is enough for me. What I want is to be able to hold a newspaper in my hands, and recognize myself in it. That is enough. He signed with initials. He gave no address. The editorial reply, printed underneath in smaller type, was one sentence long. We received your letter. We read it with care. You exist. The newspaper also contained a section that he described with characteristic flatness, a section of practical recommendations, guidance for readers on how to behave in specific situations, specifically how to behave when they encountered what he called the remont. This word remont means renovation, refurbishment, the kind of repair you do to an apartment or a piece of machinery when it has deteriorated. It had been adopted sometime in the preceding years as the name for groups of young men who organized themselves specifically to hunt gay men in Moscow. The method was consistent enough that Kalinin could describe it in general terms. In the city, there are established meeting places, locations that have been used for decades, that exist on a map that is not written down anywhere but is known to everyone who needs to know it. The fountain in the square in front of the Bolshoi Theater is one of the most prominent. On summer evenings, men gather there, at a careful and plausible distance from one another, performing the ordinary leisure activity of sitting in a public space. The Remont had learned to use these locations. They sent a scout, an attractive young man, 15 to 18 years old, who would sit near the fountain with the particular studied casualness of someone practicing at appearing independent and available. He waited. Someone approached to speak to him. The young man suggested continuing elsewhere, his apartment, a friend's apartment, somewhere private. What waited at the apartment was not a private conversation. Kalinin told me about a man he knew, Anatoly he called him, without a last name. Anatoly had understood, at some point during the process of being lured, what was happening. He managed, through whatever combination of desperation and physical agility the moment required, to get out of the apartment completely naked and onto the stairwell landing. He began ringing every doorbell on the floor, one after another. The noise of doorbells on a residential stairwell at that hour of the evening is not a subtle sound. It is the sound of something going wrong on a scale that involves the entire floor. The men inside the apartment heard it, and whatever calculation they ran in those few seconds resolved in favor of throwing his clothes through the door and letting him leave. He left. Kalinin told this story without editorializing. He had, I think, told it many times. He told it as a practical example. Here is what worked once. Here is the logic of it. Here is what you can try if you find yourself in this situation. The tone was the tone of a man who has had to be very practical about things that, in a different country or a different decade, would not require this particular form of practicality. He then told me about Nikolai Kislev. Kislev was 29 years old. He lived in a communal apartment, the shared living arrangements that this city still produces in great quantities, multiple families and individuals each occupying a room, sharing a kitchen and a bathroom, each room its own small private world within a larger involuntary community. The room is the unit of privacy in a communal apartment. It is also the unit of vulnerability. What happens in a room in a communal apartment can be heard by the neighbors on the other side of a thin wall, and the neighbors may help or may not. And in any case, there are things that happen in rooms that are over before anyone can decide whether to respond. In July, Kislev was found dead in his room. Strangled is the word Kalinin used. The word brutally preceded it. By unverified accounts, and the accounts were unverified because no police report had been filed that Kalinin could access, and the investigation, if there was one, had not produced information that reached the community in any useful form. Kislev had met two young men in the city center that evening and had invited them home. The police file, if it existed, would describe this as a homicide. It would describe the victim's name, age, address, the cause of death, and the circumstances as reconstructed from available evidence. What it would not describe, what no official document would describe, because official documents in this country do not have a category for it, is the particular weight of being a person whose way of moving through the world had been defined as criminal, who had been navigating that definition for his entire adult life, and who had on a summer evening done what any person might do, met someone in the city, felt what he felt, made a decision that belonged to him and to his own life, and not come home. I want to stay with that for a moment. He met two young men in the city center and invited them home. This sentence, in any other context, describes an ordinary evening. In this context, in this city, in the summer of 1990, it describes the last hours of Nikolai Kiselev's life. The space between those two readings is the space in which the newspaper existed, the space between an ordinary human act and the specific danger that the city attached to that act for people who were, in the language of the state, criminals by definition. Kiselev was killed in the same summer that the newspaper was registered. The registration happened. The murder happened. They did not cancel each other out. They existed simultaneously in the same city, among the same community, and this simultaneity of a legal landmark and a violent death in the same season is the shape of progress in this period, if progress is even the right word for it. Something is being gained. Something is being lost. The accounting doesn't balance. I asked Kalinin how the officials he dealt with responded when he identified himself as representing the Moscow Union of Lesbians and Homosexuals. He said, "On the surface, they try to be polite," he added, with what I recognized as the particular wry precision of a man who has spent a lot of time observing official behavior. He didn't know what they said about him after he left, or whether they went to wash their hands. External courtesy was what he had. He said, "One official from the justice organs, at the very end of an otherwise businesslike meeting, asked very seriously whether the International Organization of Lesbians and Homosexuals, with which Kalinin had mentioned they cooperated, had spy interests in the Soviet Union." He said this with the same flat delivery he had used for everything else. I understood from the delivery that this question had not surprised him. I met him in person a few days after our phone call, at a cafe near the Boulevard Ring, one of those cafes whose coffee is more gesture than beverage, but whose tables are far enough apart that you can actually talk. He was in his early 30s, thin, with attentive eyes behind glasses, and a sweater that had seen several seasons of wear. He arrived with a transparent plastic folder under his arm. Inside the folder were the 3 issues of the newspaper, flat and undamaged, the way someone carries their work rather than their business cards. He did not place the folder on the table to show me. He simply set it down next to his tea, the way a man sets down any object he has been carrying, and I understood that he carried the folder, the way other people carry a notebook, because the newspaper was what he had. He told me, at one point in that conversation, that I was the first journalist from a large Soviet publication who had not opened the interview with the question, "How did you realize?" Most interviewers, he said, made that their first question. He had learned to answer it, but each time he had to remind himself why he was answering. I told him I had not been planning to ask. He nodded once, and the conversation moved forward on a different footing. Then he told me about the Congress. The 28th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union had convened in Moscow in the summer. 10,000 delegates, the general secretaries, the party apparatus, the kind of event that the Soviet state produces with full ceremonial weight when it wishes to demonstrate its institutional continuity. The Union had wanted to hold a demonstration near the Kremlin during the Congress. The police had not permitted this. What they had been permitted to do was stand at a distance and distribute things to the delegates passing by. What they distributed was imported condoms, foreign condoms, the kind that were not available in the standard Soviet pharmacy and that had a different status and different associations than the domestic variety, which was to say, they were better and people wanted them. The delegates took the condoms. This is the detail I find I cannot stop thinking about, not because it is ironic, but because it is something more specific than irony, something that has more information in it than irony usually carries. 10,000 delegates to the Party Congress, the people who ran this country and its institutions, each of them taking a foreign condom from the hands of a member of an organization they had never officially acknowledged existed, and pocketing it without breaking stride, without looking at the person offering it, without reading the slogans on the placards the same people were holding. The condom disappeared into the jacket pocket of the Soviet state. The slogan remained unread. I have thought about that image as a kind of compressed history. The entire transaction took 3 seconds, probably less. The delegates saw the object, registered its scarcity value, foreign condoms were not freely available, and their quality was different from the domestic kind, which had a quality that everyone who used them preferred not to discuss in detail, and took it. This is a completely rational act. The delegate wanted the condom. He did not want to be seen engaging with the organization distributing it, because engaging with the organization distributing it would require acknowledging the organization's existence, which would require acknowledging the thing the organization existed to represent, which was not something the delegate intended to do at a party congress or possibly anywhere. So he took the condom and walked on. The organization counted as a success, the fact that the condom had been taken. Both parties were, in their own way, correct. One of the slogans, Callanan told me, read, "A condom protects from any infection, AIDS, syphilis, and communism." I asked him to repeat that. He did. I wrote it down. I have thought about it many times since. The joke works on a level that most political jokes do not. Most political jokes work by puncturing something, by naming the gap between the official claim and the observable reality, by saying out loud the thing that everyone knows, but that cannot be said in official channels. This one did something different. It took an object, the condom, the barrier, the prophylactic, the thing that stands between transmission and non-transmission, and extended its logic to its natural limit. If a condom protects against things that travel by intimate contact and cause disease, communism, the slogan proposed, is also a thing that travels by intimate contact and causes disease. Therefore, the condom is appropriate protection. The logic is internally consistent. The political violence of the joke is that the logic is internally consistent. The delegates did not read it. They took the condoms. After I spoke with Callanan, I spoke with a sociologist, an American, a professor at New York University, a specialist in these questions who was visiting Moscow for a conference. He had spent 30 years studying the history of gay communities in the United States, which gave him the particular usefulness of someone who has watched a transformation that had not yet happened here and could describe what it looked like from the outside. He said, "Do not make the mistake of thinking that where you are now is where the United States was before things changed. The analogy doesn't hold exactly. The Soviet experience of repression has a specific character, a specific institutional depth, that the American experience did not. The Soviet state has had 70 years to build the apparatus of this particular persecution, and apparatuses of that age have a weight and an inertia that historical comparison tends to underestimate." But here is what he could say. Until the early 1950s, homosexuality was illegal in almost every American state. Men were imprisoned. They were fired from their jobs. They were subjected to the kind of institutional persecution that produces, over time, a community that knows how to disappear. What changed in America, he said, was not primarily legislation. What changed was the decision made collectively and individually by enormous numbers of people to stop being invisible, to leave the parks and the toilets and the places that invisibility had assigned them, and to say, "We are here, we are a community, we have newspapers and political clubs and travel agencies and medical networks, and we are going to occupy space as if we have a right to occupy it." The legislation followed the visibility. The visibility came first, and it was costly, and some of the people who made themselves visible paid for it with their safety, and in some cases with more than their safety. But it was the visibility that moved things. I asked him how long did it take. He said, from the moment the community began to organize publicly, the late 1960s, roughly to the point where you could say the change was irreversible, perhaps 20 years. He paused and said, "Though of course 20 years is also someone's entire youth." And he paused again and said, "And for the people who came before, who lived in the decades when the organizing hadn't started yet, their lives were also lives. They don't count as a waiting period. They were the thing itself." Later, after the formal conversation, I asked him one more question. I asked whether, looking back over those 2 decades as a historian, there was a single moment he would identify as the one the whole transformation turned on. He said it wasn't one moment. It was accumulation. But if he had to choose a scene, he would choose one from the middle 70s, in a town in the American Midwest, not a liberal town, not a progressive parish, an ordinary Catholic church with an ordinary congregation. During a Sunday sermon, the priest had mentioned that one of his parishioners was dying from an illness that had not yet been given a name, and that this parishioner was a good man who deserved his dignity at the end of his life. The priest was not making a political statement. He was simply refusing to remove one person from the ordinary list of the parish's care. The sociologist said, the legislation comes through parliaments. But the reality changes at the point where one person calls another person a good man in a situation where no one is forcing them to. That is the scene I would choose. The rest is bookkeeping. I have been sitting with that sentence for a while. Roman Kalinin had published 3 issues of a newspaper. He had done this while Nikolai Kiselev was being strangled in a communal apartment room, while gangs were using the fountain at the Bolshoi Theater as a hunting ground, while a justice official was asking whether his international contacts had spy interests, while the police were blocking his demonstration and the delegates were pocketing his condoms. 3 issues in a year under those conditions. I keep thinking about the 3 issues as physical objects. The paper, the print, the fact of their existence as things you could hold. In this country, in this period, a publication requires registration, which requires a legal entity, which requires a name and an address and a person willing to stand behind those things with their real identity. Kalinin stood behind them. His name is on the masthead, his real name, not a pseudonym. The contact address used a woman's name, that much concession to prudence, but his name was there. 3 issues. Each one added courage, he had said. Not the disappearance of fear, the accumulated evidence that the fear did not have to be the last word. That is a different thing from safety. It is a different thing from victory. It is a thing that happens while men are being strangled in communal apartments and delegates are pocketing condoms without reading the slogans, and officials are asking about spies. It is what happens anyway, in the available space, with the available materials, by the people who decide to do it. The slogan was, "A condom protects from any infection, AIDS, syphilis, and communism." I keep thinking about the delegates who didn't read it. I keep thinking about the people who held the sign. I am recording this late. The building is quiet. Somewhere in this city, the 4th issue is being prepared. I don't know if it will come out. I have no way to know that. What I know is that 3 have come out already, and that this is a fact that belongs to the record of this year, and that the record of this year also includes Nikolai Kiselev, 29 years old, room in a communal apartment. July. Both facts. Not one or the other.